Well, the first thing I want to ask you about is how did you end up in Wheeling randomly?
I was visiting friends, and they live in Ohio, right on the border there on the river.
Yeah.
And yeah, I had a great time. It was a really beautiful part of the world, and I'm glad I got to visit. And it was a bit unexpected, but I had a great time. Yeah,
What
it
you
was
guys
really
do in
fun.
Wheeling?
Well, we stopped by, and I got to explore a little bit. And then we visited my friend's boathouse, where they actually had the motor races that day. They had a regatta with the
Oh, the
speedboats
Race
going
Car
up and down the
Regatta.
river, which
Yeah,
was
that's like right
very
down the
cool.
street from our station, actually. That's so funny.
Oh, no way. Yeah, I was right there. I had the best time, and we'll definitely be going back. I'm actually going back to the US this summer, so I can't wait to visit again.
Well, if
Everyone
you
was
make,
really friendly.
yeah, if you make it to Wheeling, let me know. I'll take you out.
You bet. That'll be awesome.
All right, now to the grand moment is here. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Titanic. I had some questions, but I want to start off with just sort of 113 years later, with everything that we now know of the sinking. Sort of take me through a very kind of brief summary of what happened, sort of from your expert opinion on it.
Titanic was everybody knows the largest ship in the world at the time. She was one in a series of increasingly larger, faster, more impressive ships. Until Titanic had come along, ocean travel was a very dicey proposition. It definitely wasn't an exact science. And for a long time there in the 1800s and before, you were really taking your life almost into your own hands traveling big distances on ships going across the Atlantic, coming out to Australia, where I am. That would take months and months and months. And there's no guarantee you'd reach your destination at the other end. There's a great example of a line of ships, the Lock Line, which had 25 beautiful sailing ships, and only five ever made it to scrapping because so many were lost in collisions or disappeared or sank. So, after this long period of time of development and getting ships to where we needed them to be to reliably travel, Titanic comes at the end of this process by about 1911, 1912, and she's a huge upgrade in size and comfort and luxury and all of the things that we know about and safety. Ironically, she was probably the safest ship that had been built to carry passengers up until that point, which might seem a bit counterintuitive. Of course, steaming out across the North Atlantic at that time, around about April, there is some pretty significant ice activity as icebergs carve off from far north in the North Atlantic. And as we all know, Titanic had an encounter with an ice field, a very large field of icebergs that were drifting through the North Atlantic. And she sank with a very significant loss of life. And this completely changed the way that shipbuilders and the public thought about how ships should be built and how they should be operated. And we still feel the ramifications of that to this day.
Did you ever read the Win Craig Wade Titanic book about the investigations following the sinking?
No, look, the inquiries blow my mind. They're so interesting. I don't know that I've read that book off the top of my head, but there are moments in the inquiries and the investigations afterwards that I've almost been screaming at the page saying, why, why did you come to this conclusion? Even the inquiries, some of the findings at certain times were a little bit questionable. So it was an indictment on British shipbuilding at a time when Britain was trying to assert dominance at sea. Even though this is a commercial passenger carrying venture, Britain's also locked in a really what will become a deadly arms race with Germany to create the biggest and the best dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers. And so it is tied very intrinsically with national pride, ships like Titanic. And so even when you get to the point of inquiries and investigations, there are certain parts, not that the entire thing was a whitewash, but I think it's pretty clear that in areas there were things that were made the official record that probably shouldn't have been.
I know one of the things I'm always struck by is, I was watching the video you did on had the Titanic just struck dead on. And I thought, I believe it was in that video you were extremely sympathetic to Murdoch for basically saying, like, hey, listen, he did what he was supposed to do by the books at the time. Sort of with, the benefit of hindsight now, what would the ultimate move for the crew have been sort of before they hit the iceberg and then as they saw it? What should they have done?
So the decision was made by Titanic's captain to keep on track for New York because a late arrival or a delayed arrival would be a huge pain. Because much in the same way today that we travel, we have connecting flights and things like that. Awaiting the passengers at the other end of the voyage in New York were carriages and trains and buses to take them all through the US. So arriving late means that all of these have to be rebooked while Titanic is still at sea, which is a huge pain. So Smith had a very good reason to get into New York on time, which really had nothing to do with setting a speed record, contrary to popular belief. So he decides to go through an ice field. Now, the decision to do that was gambling. It definitely was a gamble. And so the move from Smith would have been to enhance probably the lookout. And ironically, we know that, of course, Titanic had a crow's nest, which is above the bridge on the masthead. It has great peripheral vision around the ship, a beautiful, like 360-degree view all around. So you had two men up there who were on relatively short watches, keeping an eye out for what lay ahead. But actually, if you'd position more men further down, probably at the level of the bow, the deck there, where the famous scene takes place in the film, the flying scene in Titanic, that's part of the ship called the prow, and that getting lower to the horizon and having men positioned up there keeping watch from that point would probably have spotted the iceberg sooner because the berg was essentially obscured by the darkness and obscured by the horizon because it was such a dark, clear night. The iceberg wasn't really seen. It was more that the crew who were the lookouts spotted a lack of stars on the horizon. So getting more eyes forward and getting them lower down would probably have spotted the berg seconds earlier. Even seconds earlier would have made all the difference because they almost made it. They almost cleared the berg by steering. They just grazed it, and even 2, 3, 4 seconds could have made all the difference. They had around 35 seconds from the point of spotting the berg to the point of collision, so it was a very, very short amount of time. So I would imagine that more detection, more eyes up ahead would have made a huge, huge difference.
I know one of the things, the more you read about this, you have to kind of get the James Cameron Night to Remember visuals out of your head to sort of figure out like it was so dark. The I mean, the water was basically perfectly flat. There's just nothing brushing up against these icebergs to make any kind of notice. And so, from a sort of a modern perspective, what do ships do now differently to detect these things? I mean, obviously we have much better sonar and all that stuff, but like you take the Titanic in a time machine, put it in the waters in 2012 as opposed to 1912. What would be the modern technological advances that would have allowed them to see the iceberg much quicker?
One of the big changes following Titanic sinking was the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, which keep track as best they can of bergs coming down south into the North Atlantic sea lanes. Because back then, the North Atlantic was like a giant highway. The ships weren't just crisscrossing wherever they wanted. Ships followed very predetermined paths in the same way you would a road. And it's especially true today. If you fire up any vessel tracker website, you'll see they're all following neat lines. It's like roads crossing the North Atlantic. And so the Ice Patrol is then able to keep an eye on bergs as they come down near those sea lanes and keep an eye on them. But the biggest change, as you mentioned, is the technology, radar. So a modern big cruise ship or big passenger liner, like the Queen Mary 2, for instance, I was on her in June. We were doing a westbound transatlantic crossing for New York, and an iceberg came within about 100 miles of us, which in the North Atlantic is fairly close, and it was enough that the captain made an announcement and said, "Look, you're not going to see it, but there is an iceberg just out there." And ironically, it was around about the point we were crossing near to the Titanic wreck. So they do come down, but ships now have the capacity to spot bergs out to miles at a time. I think somewhere around like 5 miles at a minimum. So we're talking big distances now, and especially with climate change and what's going on, bergs are melting. Essentially, it seems to be melting sooner as when they get into the North Atlantic, and so it is a different kind of playing field. But the technology and the tracking of the bergs would essentially render ships like the Queen Mary 2, and if Titanic were to be given radar, she would have actually seen that night. It's a really interesting point. Not just one iceberg, but hundreds. in this big field that was drifting and melting essentially as it went further south. They would have seen them all and they would have had a more clear understanding of what was out ahead. What they had to rely on at that point in time was radio messages from other ships. And then essentially what Titanic's captain would have been doing is he was receiving these messages saying, um, SS Republic, we've seen ice up here. So he goes to his chart, takes the position that he's been given, and draws an X on his map. And by putting these all together, he can, in his mind, form on the map a rough idea of what the ice field might look like. Of course, now you'll be able to see it from miles away in perfect detail. So it's a completely different world. And part of that is kind of thanks to the Titanic tragedy demonstrating what needed to be done in order to improve safety standards.
No, it's one of those, and I think it's one of the reasons that everyone's still so obsessed with the Titanic 113 years later was because it wasn't just this one night. It had these massive ramifications from nautical law, nautical procedures, and then even, it goes down to like US tort law in terms of like how you can sue entities. I mean, the impact of this sinking was just, we're still feeling it today on a number of legal fronts. And then also just kind of, there's almost a romanticism to this tragedy because you had all these insane stories of men putting women into the ships and staying themselves. Sort of 113 years later, what are the things that resonate most with you?
I mean, we all like to imagine ourselves there and think, what would I have done? We all like to put ourselves in the position of the flippant gentleman standing aside and smoking cigars and kind of putting on this act of, oh, we don't really care, playing poker until the last minute, that kind of thing. And I think the reason it's so endearing to our imagination is because unlike other ships that sank around about the same time, like Lusitania, which sank in 18 minutes, or the Empress of Ireland, which rolled over after about 10 minutes of sinking, then was gone within 14. I mean, these were incredibly violent, sudden sinkings that probably played almost as important a role in the development of safety and building ships safely as Titanic did. But they're not as prevalent in the public mind because they were so sudden and so violent. You don't get time for this drama to play out. And Titanic sank slowly, around 2 and a bit hours, and evenly. And so you have this time for this drama to play out. And so I think it's interesting that it completely transcends culture. I mean, people in all over the world, from India to China to Australia to New Zealand to America, can all relate to the same story. So it clearly touches something that's innately human that we all find compelling, and it's this, to my mind, this combining of things like nostalgia for this kind of naive, beautiful era before the First World War, before almost like modern cynicism and that wide scale existential death had gripped the public when technology was improving all the time and the sky was the limit and they had aeroplanes, so I guess the sky wasn't the limit, versus the tragedy of the realization that actually, wow, this utopia is built on sand and it shifts. And Titanic was probably the first big shock to the culture and to the system, and then the First World War was the second big one when suddenly all of this beautiful world and all this planning and all of this development and culture results in wide scale death. And so I think combining tragedy with nostalgia for a world that doesn't exist anymore and the sadness of that misplaced optimism being so badly destroyed, I think is what draws us all into it. And it's especially what draws me to it for sure.
The most, the most interesting characters, I use that word. They've kind of become characters over the years. Like, who are the people on the Titanic, the passengers, that you find yourself sort of deep diving in over and over again? I know for me, it's Lightoller and Charles Joffin, the baker. Those two
Right.
guys are just. At some point, I want to do a whole story on Joffin because he's like, I think, the most fascinating person from that entire night. But who are the guys or who are the passengers that you find yourself gravitating toward?
There's such an interesting mix of people. I mean, the when I was a kid, I was so interested in the crew, like Thomas Andrews, for
Oh yeah,
example, one of the ship's designers. has become like a trope. He's become a caricature of a guy. And, he was played by Victor Garber in the film Titanic in 97. He's a very sympathetic person, but learning more about him as a human, a real human being, and reading stories about people who just knew him and were mates with him and played on the same rugby team as him. And it's weird because you spend so much time thinking of these people as characters like in a play and less about, here's a good example. Bruce Ismay, J. Bruce Ismay, was the chairman of the White Star Line. He was on board officially as a passenger, and he was pilloried by the press for escaping, jumping into a lifeboat when people around him couldn't find spots in boats. Never mind the fact he got into a lifeboat when there weren't that many people around, and he saved his life. But his reputation was ruined, and people still take a dim view of him. He's seen as the villain of the story. But he had kids waiting at home. He had, there was a whole history to this guy that is really fascinating to learn about. And, he had I think two young children waiting for him. And, I mean, what parent out there is fully comfortable with accepting their own death when you have people waiting for you at home that depend on you, and that was omitted by the press. That wasn't pertinent. But there are also passengers aboard that are very much of the times, like Margaret Brown. We know her as Molly today. At the time, she was Maggie Brown, a huge champion for women's rights. Elsie Bauman and some of her colleagues were very heavily involved in the suffragette movement and women's suffrage, a very specific school of women's rights demonstrations at the time, trying to get the vote. It's a very it's like a time of great upheaval socially, and it seems like all of these people were on the same ship. So you can essentially leaf through any book or go to the website Encyclopedia Titanica and find somebody who, to your point, is probably the most interesting person on the night because there were so many of them, and even the migrants and folks coming out to America for new lives. You had, in second class, Percy Bailey, who was offered a butcher's apprenticeship over in the US. And so he leaves his mum and dad behind, and there's a tearful goodbye. And he's going over to become a butcher. And when the ship's sinking, he's just waiting there patiently for instruction, and he's never seen again, and just these stories that we can all relate to, going to start a new job, going to university, all this stuff, all these people were doing. And it all stopped right there, and they ended up where no one should be, in the most alien place in the middle of the North Atlantic. I think it's so compelling. So, yeah, I flip flop between who I am most drawn to, but seriously, fire up Encyclopedia Titanica on the internet and just start reading random passenger pages because you'll get drawn in. It's a dangerous game because you'll lose a couple of nights doing it.
Thanks for telling me because I've never been to that site. So I have a feeling I know what my deep dive is going to be this evening.
You'll lose hours.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of the sinking. Take me through sort of the watertight compartments, how they functioned, and why they failed when the iceberg just kept kind of poking holes throughout the one side of the ship.
Yeah, well, watertight compartments are probably something we take for granted today, but back then it was a relatively recent introduction to ships. Until then, ships had been they had big open holds, and if the ship was holed anywhere along its hull, then those cargo holds would flood. The water would be able to run throughout the ship totally unimpeded, and the ship would sink in a matter of minutes. But around about the 19th century, designers realized actually, if we erect steel walls inside the ship that essentially cut it into sections inside, then the water, if it enters part of the hull, will only flood that compartment. So even though the steel walls, the watertight bulkheads, only went so far up in the hull, and were open on top, essentially, kind of like an ice cube tray, the theory was, especially with Titanic, that you could haul two, three, maybe even four of these compartments, the ship would still stay afloat. Thomas Andrews, one of the ship's designers, almost ominously was telling people that you could actually cut Titanic in half and both sections would remain afloat because essentially they would be their self-contained ships thanks to these compartments. Now, this wisdom was based on conventional lessons that had been learned up to that point, that ships were likely to encounter A very small selection of potential damages or damaging events. You could be rammed from the side by another ship in a collision. That would open up one or two watertight compartments because the ship hitting you is only so wide, right? You could run straight into a rock or an iceberg or something big like that would smash in the front of your ship, kind of like crashing a car. But the anything behind that would be fine, and the watertight compartments wouldn't be, breached. Um, what hadn't really happened up until that point was the kind of grazing blow that pops rivets, that puts the ship's side locally in that area under extreme pressure because you've got a 50,000 ton object moving at about 20, 30 plus miles per hour. And you've got an immovable object. This is not an ice cube. It's densely compacted glacial ice that's tens of thousands of years old. That is more like rock, and it weighs probably 1 million tons. It's not moving. Um, that's what Titanic struck with a glancing blow. Absolutely not what you want to be hitting. So it's this kind of damage that hadn't been imagined to be a thing, to be possible. And it's exactly the fault in the system because by opening up just a slight hole that runs a long way down the hull, you've now got 5 or 6 compartments flooding. Of course, the ship's designed to stay afloat with 3 or 4, depending on where. So it completely overwhelmed the system. It just wasn't designed for that. And so the ship sank. The result of that was, of course, well, let's raise bulkheads in ships into the future. So for a long time, ships were being built to stay afloat with still 4 or 5 compartments flooded, but the bulkheads would now go instead of finishing about halfway up the hull, they'd go all the way up to the upper decks. But it may surprise you to know that the way ships are built today is different. Cruise ships and big passenger ships like that are really only designed to stay afloat with usually about 2 compartments flooded because now they rely on detection systems like radar to never get into a position where you'd be colliding with something in the first place. They've long given up on the idea of the unsinkable ship. So the way that they build ships and rely on watertight bulkheads has changed. Ships still have watertight bulkheads, but they're not designed to stay afloat with 4 of them flooded or 5 of them flooded. So it is still different then again because we rely so much on navigational aids, radar, enhanced detection, and that kind of thing. So it's yeah, completely different design philosophy.
Well, and now you see like these modern, like you look at like a Carnival cruise liner, people do the infographics where they put it up next to the Titanic and it dwarfs it. And I mean, with the size of these objects, you know, buoyancy is a heck of a thing. Just trying to figure out how these things stay afloat, let alone keeping them afloat.
It's a engineering challenge. Engineers like to be challenged. That's a good one. Before Titanic sank, there was a author had written a book called Futility or the Wreck of the Titan, which was a hypothetical book about what would happen if a modern day ocean liner back then in the late 19th century, early 20th century struck an iceberg and sank. And it got a little bit fantastical in science fiction, but the author Morgan Robinson, yeah, the author was concerned about are we pushing this too far? It's probably about time until one of these has a serious accident. Without like casting too much aspersion over a whole industry, I think we're almost approaching the same situation where we're really pushing this technology and we're pushing as many people as possible onto a ship without the technology has been improved so much since, but we can't become complacent. I think shipbuilders and ship operators cannot be cutting corners, cannot be complacent. And we saw that with Costa Concordia. We saw a complete ignoring of the rules, the very rules that exist to prevent this kind of thing. Titanic, for example, was not meant to sail or steam into an ice field. Costa Concordia was not meant to hug a rocky outcrop to salute a town. She had her compartments open and she sank. Just wasn't designed for it. So complacency is probably the biggest danger here. And so long as operators and builders are not being complacent, then Titanic shouldn't happen again. But it's the moment we let our guard down that nature likes to remind us that we're not top dog. as much as we like to think we are.
It's like how they say history rhymes. People become over reliant on technology, and then you get a terrible tragedy. It's
Between you and I, this is probably off the record, but on ships like Queen Mary 2 and passenger ships like that, until recently, you had to do the whole lifeboat drill when you boarded. You had to put your life belt on. You had to go to your boat station and wait. And I found it really fun because it was kind of like role playing, like a ship sinking. Everyone was out in their
yeah. If
vests
you're into
and
ships, that's probably a great thing to do.
right. But with COVID, they've instituted instead kind of like a touch on thing, like you would touch on your credit card getting onto the subway. So when you board, you go to a muster station at a buffet, and there'll be someone there with the flag with your number on it, and you just touch on, and you don't think about it again. And if you had a ship the size of like any of these big carnival ships run into trouble, they would have about an hour to stay afloat, maybe. It would be leaning over about 15 or 20 degrees, and you'd have 6,000 people with no idea where to go because 7 days ago, all they had to do was go and boop, and then they just completely forgot about it. I think the complacency is actually already there. And to my mind, I I think it's a matter of time, really, before we have a another big passenger ship loss, the scale probably of which we wouldn't have ever seen before. Seriously, like it's kind of you know almost overdue at this point.
Well, and we've had some near misses. I mean, you mentioned Costa Concordia. They were at least lucky. They were pretty close to shore at that point. But
Yeah,
I
on that
mean,
shelf
yeah, I
as
mean
well. Yeah,
that happens 5 miles out to sea. Even we could be talking about a very different scenario.
absolutely. Yeah,
No, it's every time I watch one of those, I'm obsessed with online fight videos, and there's
yeah.
been a couple of classic cruise ship ones, and I just always think about trying to wrangle just a mob of people in a like a real emergency scenario. I don't know if we're quite ready for it.
No, no, totally no, totally no. Yeah, absolutely not. It's the crowd control bit is what probably scares me the
I know,
most.
and that's one of the more interesting things about Titanic, in that like everyone, for the most part, pretty well behaved. Some of the officers they talk about getting pistols out. I don't think they really ever had to use them. The movie took some liberties with that, but
It seems like passengers were shot. So it seems like that did happen.
it's
The
hard to say
what's
because I feel like there's a lot of. We were talking earlier about how this is like a great stain on Britain's history, and it makes me wonder. It's like, what are the stories that like no one ever admitted to, or there were no survivors to tell us about? Because the people on the lifeboats are where a large amount of these firsthand accounts come from, and they were gone for that last, really probably that last 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm always fascinated by what life was like on that ship in the final moments, especially when the lights got dimmer and went red. Like I
mm,
can't even imagine being on there at that point.
yeah, we have a couple of interesting accounts from people who were on it really until the very end. One of the probably the most interesting is Frank Prentice, who was um, essentially he was a crew member, but he was hanging onto the stern of the ship as it was coming higher and higher out of the water, and ended up jumping for it, like in the film, and he survived. And I think only maybe two. Actually, I can think of just a couple of people, like Charles Jokin, the baker, survived at that point, being at the stern of the ship because it was so late in the sinking. Frank Prentice was just lucky he found a lifeboat. So, but I think what's interesting with Titanic and how calm things were was you had two things going for the ship at that point, which is first of all, it was very, very difficult to tell that it was sinking for about an hour and a half. It was very confusing because Titanic was built with very pronounced shear, which is that kind of like a banana. Her forward and aft ends at the back curve up at both
Oh,
ends, about uh, between 3 and 5 degrees, I think. I forget exactly how much, but that was to help buoyancy in rough seas, pitching. So you essentially have more ship at either end, so it's not going to be plunging down, right? Um, but it meant when the ship was sinking, it was sinking for a long time at about a 5 degree angle down trim. And so if you essentially didn't feel the slant of the deck underfoot. You got very used to it, and it just felt like the floor was steady. All the lights were on. It was nice and warm inside. It was pitch black and freezing cold outside. And you've got people telling you to get into a lifeboat. The lifeboats are dangling about 8, 9 stories above the ocean, um, and you can't see anything out there. So you're really being asked to take a leap of faith. So they had a real hard time getting people into the boats because why would you? There was no coordinated rousing of passengers, really. It was very ragtag. The other interesting thing about Titanic is there was a fairly extensive evacuation plan devised for both Olympic and Titanic that called for the different classes of passengers to gather in certain areas and await instruction. The third class passengers did exactly as they had been told to do, which is that they gathered in the aft well deck at the stern of the ship, many of them with their belongings in cases, which is literally all they owned, and they awaited instruction, which is what they were told essentially to do. And they waited there all night, and no one came for them. And so the evacuation plan had some pretty serious faults, which is that first of all, there were no stairs, there were no ladders connecting where the third class passengers were with the location of the lifeboats on the boat deck. There was no way to actually get from that part of the ship up to there. So you had passengers kind of taking it into their own hands and climbing up the ship's cranes and the rigging to get 2 decks up, 3 decks up to get to the boats. The other huge fatal flaw was that there was a big difference between Olympic and Titanic, which is that Titanic's promenade deck, which was this nice open walking space, was half enclosed with these big screens with windows in them to provide first class passengers a little bit more protection from sea spray. But the evacuation plan was devised for both ships and actually called for the lifeboats to be lowered down to that deck so passengers could board them from the promenade deck. So passengers were waiting in the promenade deck, but of course the boats came down, and for half of the ship, they couldn't get into the boats because there were these screens. So when they were designing the ship and designing this evacuation plan, it hadn't occurred to anybody that this plan won't be valid for Titanic because nobody can get into the boats in the forward half of the ship. And even Captain Smith on the night didn't occur to him. It was too late that they realized, oh, actually no, we won't be able to do this. So the boats were loaded from the boat deck, which they were never intended to be loaded from. So the whole thing was a bit of a confused mess. And even though there was an evacuation plan that was quite extensive, it had a couple of faults and it just fell apart. But it took a long time to unravel because passengers did as they were told. First class waited on the promenade deck, third class waited where they needed to, and second class did as well. The people were waiting to be told what to do. In the case of first class, they were in the boats right off the bat. Second class, a little bit better, but third, they were just left to wait. And by the time someone finally came essentially to get them, it was too late.
It was almost I mean, really the entirety of Titanic, you can almost sum up as like, it's the perfect storm of outlier situations coming together and causing a tragedy. I mean, there's,
Yeah.
the mistake in the mistake in the evacuation plans, uh, a totally bizarre weather, well, not bizarre, but a perfect weather night to not see an iceberg.
Bizarre is the perfect word for it. It was bizarre. I'll stand by that. Weird conditions, like
Yeah,
crystal clear.
yeah, your history of your nautical history is much better than mine.
No, no, no. You had it.
Yeah,
You had
yeah.
it.
So, tell me a little bit about, and I'll try not to keep you too much longer, but tell me a little bit about sort of the mad dash of the Carpathia to the Titanic. They were about 4 hours away, I think. And I think it was the captain of the Carpathia basically said, like, when I saw the ice in the morning, I knew God was with me. It's something, I'm paraphrasing him, but it was just, describe to me the utterly insane ice conditions and the miraculous dash to save the passengers that did survive.
Yeah, it was a very unfortunate position for Titanic to be in because a lot of the ships that were around to help that did receive their distress calls were boxed in by the ice. They had their engines off for the night, which, reheating boilers can take about 6 hours to get a ship underway. So there were some ships that weren't able to help at all. But Carpathia, she was heading the opposite direction to Titanic. And when she got the distress call, her captain, Arthur Rostron, who was a very pious, very a quite experienced skipper. He was in command of Carpathia, which was a big for a ship of her size, but tiny compared to Titanic. She was a combination passenger cargo ship that had been designed really to carry cattle, and so her hull was lined with. Recently, we found markings for dung ports, so to scoop out the animal waste. She wasn't carrying animals; she was carrying a lot of migrants and some first class as well, heading for Fiume over in the Mediterranean. And so the captain Rostron had this moment of plotting out on his chart where Titanic was and realizing he would have to go through the very ice field that Titanic had. and he just springs into action. He rouses his entire crew, and it's really amazing actually comparing his actions with those of other skippers of the night and through history as well, because this was exactly the right man for exactly the right moment. He orders um, as much steam as possible to be put on the ship's fairly modest engines, shutting off hot water so that the steam can be diverted into the engines instead to raise that pressure to get them turning as quickly as possible to get the ship thundering along at a speed that she had never been able to achieve before. Get hot coffee made, soup, gather as many blankets as possible. Because on this modest ship, Rostron is now expected to take in excess of 2,000 people who are cold and have been in freezing conditions all night. So he is doing everything he can, opening the doors, swinging out slings to bring people up who might be infirm or injured. But probably one of the most crucial things is he posts over a dozen men forward at the forward end of the ship, exactly where I talked about earlier, lower down to keep an eye out for icebergs. And they get into that ice field and they start spotting bergs and having to go around them. And so it's a mad dash to begin with, but then they have to slow down to a crawl because they are dodging icebergs left and right. And they get to Titanic's last reported position, and there's nothing. But as the dawn slowly comes on, they start to see green lights, and they think maybe that's the ship. And there's a moment of hope that maybe they've arrived in time, but it's actually a green light from one of the boats, one of the lifeboats that comes alongside, and they learn that Titanic's gone. And so they begin to gather these tiny little wooden boats for the rest of the morning. And instead of 2,200 odd people, there's a little over 700 that come on board. And it's a real gut punch for the crew of Carpathia, because even though White Star Line is a rival company, the maritime world was very small, and they would have all known each other. All the officers would have known each other, and it was a devastating blow for the entire seagoing profession to learn that a ship that grand, the cutting edge, had been lost on its maiden voyage. But the efforts of Carpathia were really like one of the great heroic rescue stories of our time that has kind of been a little bit overlooked because of the scale of the Titanic tragedy in and of itself. But Carpathia deserves its own movie. James Cameron, if you're watching this, that would be a good sequel. People laughed about Titanic 2 sequel idea, but the Carpathia angle is the one to do, I think. Yeah.
I would actually love to see a big budget, A Night to Remember retelling. The 50s movie is actually incredible. I'm always shocked by how like great it looks. And someone just went and did a
Yeah.
colorized version and put it on YouTube that's also really good. But there's
Yeah.
so many stories, like from the Carpathia to individual passes. I mean, you could follow, just do the Thomas Andrews movie and just follow him
Yeah.
like in real time. There's
Totally.
no shortage of great things. All right.
James Bissett, who was the third officer on Carpathia, he was there that night, and he eventually went on to become Cunard Line's Commodore and was in command of the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, the biggest ocean liners in the world. And he had such an interesting career. So his memoirs are probably, if you're looking for something to read, so interesting because he was there that night and he has some amazing insight, but would then also go on to become a captain himself. And so it's interesting seeing him not indicting Captain Smith because he's not comfortable doing that. He won't go so far as to criticize his decision making as a colleague, but he will say, I would probably do things a little bit differently, which is very telling about the pride of the men in command of big ships.
Truly was the era of gentlemen. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
All right. So I have one more question for you, Titanic related. A little bit about the I believe it was the Ocean Gate sinking 2 years ago. I think that's when your channel blew up. I think that's when I first heard of you, was you covering that. Tell me a little bit about how that sort of added a completely new wrinkle to the Titanic's story history.
yeah. I've got a yeah. It's it's a tough one to talk about almost because it's just so sad. There had been a number of really positive, fun stories about Titanic. Magellan, the cracking, deep sea exploration company, had done a full scan of the Titanic wreck and brought it to the public in a way that hadn't been seen before, and it was really exciting. And I think that the Ocean Gate tragedy really. it was sad, I think, to see Titanic linked once again with loss of life because in the years since Titanic's been lost, even though she still is a gravesite, the ship has contributed hugely to how we understand, deep sea biology, even and all these things, and it's become almost, I think, in some ways, a symbol of human daring do and picking ourselves up and dusting ourselves off. I still see us as the underdogs in the story for the conquest of nature. It's nice to see us people and our technology doing things and triumphing, putting people on the moon, sending people 4 kilometers, 3 kilometers deep to the bottom of the ocean. And so when we fail and when we stumble, it leaves me with a real sense of sadness and melancholy. The result, the impact that it had on Titanic, though, in a way, as always with tragedies, is it spreads awareness. And so they won't build a submersible the way they built Titan again, for good reason. And we understand why. The general public understands why. It did raise awareness around the Titanic wreck, and personally, yeah, it had a huge injection on the YouTube channel that we run, and all the videos that we made about Titanic got a lot of attention. But the same thing happened when the positive story had broken that Magellan had scanned the Titanic wreck. So I have a real kind of complex personal relationship with that period in time, and it was just such an awful thing. The waiting, for to hear the news, and yeah, I still get a little sad thinking about it. But if there's any positive to come out of it, it's that there's been, like the Titanic disaster itself, there's been reform, there's been lessons learned and abided by, and I think that will have to be the longest lasting legacy is that we pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and crack on with deep sea exploration, technological advances, learning things, and bringing things like Titanic to the world in a compelling way. And that's what Magellan is doing today. So I think looking at companies like them and seeing the way that they treat these wrecks with reverence and record the state will be a good thing to follow, and hopefully more positive news stories.
Would you go down if given the opportunity?
No.
Do it.
No,
What
no.
if you're
Like,
with James Cameron and Robert Ballard?
uh, you can't tell, but I'm 6'5",
Are you really?
and I'm 6'5", and squeezing me into a submersible, like, I'm like 6'5", 200 something pounds. I'm not getting into a submersible. You might get me in, but you might have a hard time pulling me out.
Yeah, I'm 5'4". I'm like the perfect size for it. All right. So one
Yeah,
last
not anytime
question.
soon.
One last question. This one's about you personally. How'd you get into
Uh,
all this stuff?
Well, my dad was a migrant on a ship. He came out to Australia in the 50s on a big old passenger ship called the Strathnaver, which was beautiful. It was only built about 20 odd years after Titanic. She was a stunning old ship, and he was only 9 or 10, and he became obsessed with ships, and it definitely rubbed off on me. And when I was quite young and impressionable, the Titanic film came out, and you know, James Cameron, I think, is such a brilliant director. The film is so captivating. It puts you there. It's still good. People like to rag on it, but I think it's the pinnacle of bringing history to life in a really compelling way. So it definitely inspired me. And so when you get all these things together, you end up with a tragic ship nerd like myself.